ado, I want to introduce our speaker, Debbie Cannon. She is the chair of the Inland Empire Capacity Builders Network, also the vice president and COO of Academy for Grassroots Organizations. Welcome, Debbie, and take it away.
Thank you, Karina. Thank you. It's nice to see everyone here today, and it's going to be an exciting day. And I just want to explain just really briefly how this came about. The Inland Empire Capacity Builders Network is a collaboration aimed at leveraging expertise and resources in order to support a strong, responsive, and resilient nonprofit sector in our region. And we started talking to the members and some outside members at the end of last year, actually. And we wanted to put something together for the Capacity Builders Network that you can see on the screen. These are our main collaborators, and we were going to fly Jan down here and have a whole big day here, but that thing called COVID hit. So here we are, and thank you, CalNonprofits, for helping us put this together. We couldn't have done it without you, and we'll thank you more. But these are the major organizations, so a big shout out to that. And Susie Gomez from Inland Empire Community, I'm sorry, Susie Gomez here from IECC Community, Inland Empire Community Collaborative, and she is the vice chair on this. So our goal is to just bring you some information today about the state of nonprofits, and Jan Masaoka is going to start. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Jan Masaoka. Jan is the California Association of Nonprofits, is the CEO of the California Association of Nonprofits, a statewide policy alliance of more than 10,000 nonprofits. 10,000 nonprofits speaking to government, philanthropy, and there she goes. Thank you, Jan. Welcome.
Thank you, Debbie. It's really always so fun to work with Debbie and Vicki from Academy Go. And I just wanted to say also speaking today is Karthick Ramakrishnan. You can see his photo on this slide. He's of course at UC Riverside. He doesn't need really any introduction to people on this call. I'm sure everybody knows him and the important work that he's been doing. And I also just wanted to give a quick shout out to the CalNonprofit staff that's managing all the behind the screen stuff. Like you already met Karina, but also Christine Metropolis is also on our staff and doing a lot of the behind the scenes work. So, you know, I have to say that it's actually a little strange almost to be talking about something other than the coronavirus. So we will have time to talk about public policy and COVID-19 later, but as Debbie pointed out, we originally talked about this as looking at the economic impact of California's nonprofit community. So that's what we're going to kind of focus on. And then after I do this, then Karthick's going to give you some special information about the Inland Empire. So, and then we'll get into kind of a little bit more of everybody talking on the matters of policy. All right, so, and don't forget to write questions in the boxes or comments. They don't necessarily have to be questions. Okay, so can they also see me? I just want to know, you guys know, can they see me too, or are they just seeing the slide?
I don't know the answer.
I think they can see both. I can see both.
Okay,
Yes.
Great. All right. So, all right, so as everybody read like 100 or at least seen the headlines of 100 economic impact studies, right? You've seen an economic impact study about the peripheral canal or about the high-speed rail or about the port or about something new happening here or there. And there had never actually been, until we did the first one a few years ago, an economic impact study of California's nonprofit sector. So that's what this is. And actually here's what it looks like in real life. And it's like, you know, it makes a very good Christmas present, by the way. In hard copy, you can also download it for free. And we did it just mentioning with the University of San Diego. And this, I'm not going to go over this, but I wanted to show you this so that you know we didn't make it up, right? So we had a lot of data, most of it objective data. We did do 2 surveys, but most of this is coming from 990s, from particularly the Federal Audit Clearinghouse, a lot of county-based data, a lot of Department of Labor data. So, and there's a full methodology in the book if you want to see that. All right, so I'm going to do this as kind of like a quiz, except that, usually in a classroom or something, people can raise their hands and vote which one they're voting for, but you're just going to have to think to yourself, okay, what your answer is. So the first one is this: 1 out of how many jobs is at a nonprofit? Is it 1 out of 14? Think to yourself. Is it 1 out of 26? Is it 1 out of 39? What are you guys voting? All right, here's the answer. 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. Aren't you surprised? So one of the things that tells you is, so now you know when you go to a family reunion and there always ends up being there somebody there who also works for a nonprofit. Now you know that isn't just a strange coincidence, because we actually are really a significant part of California's workforce. And in fact, if all the people that worked in California nonprofits were a state, we would be bigger than Delaware. And how many senators does Delaware have? 2, okay? And how many senators does California nonprofit community have? 0, all right? And that's why we have to be louder and bigger and more organized, okay? Because even though we have this kind of a population, we don't get to elect our own senators. All right, in fact, we have some industries are usually measured by employment, and actually nonprofits are California's 4th largest industry. We are actually, you can see this here, we are actually bigger than construction, right? We are bigger than retail, not retail, we're bigger than administrative services, we're bigger than real estate, we're bigger than finance, we're bigger than entertainment. And how many times have you heard somebody say something like, well, we really need to create construction jobs? Well, we need to have people saying in a similar way, we really need to create nonprofit jobs, right? Because really we are the 4th largest industry by employment in California. And we need to take that role seriously, and we need to get other people to take it seriously as well. So in addition to all those people who work for California nonprofits, we also mobilize almost 5 million volunteers, and they contribute the equivalent of 331,000 full-time jobs, right? So that's really a lot of people, so our staff time mobilizes a very large number of volunteers as well. And in fact, if we take all nonprofit hours together, 22% of them are nonprofit hours. I'm sorry, 22% are volunteer hours. So it just shows you that volunteerism is not something that just sort of helps out on the margins. It's really core importance to the kind of work we do. But I do want to point out a couple of troubling signs, all right? We are in the 15th year of a slide in volunteerism rates, right? Every year for the last 15 years, it's getting lower. And if you look at volunteer rates, California is doing worse than other states. We used to be 34th in the nation in volunteering, and now we're 47th, right? So we shouldn't take this huge volunteer workforce for granted. It's something that from a policy level to an individual level, we need to take more seriously. And one of the things we've been working on is something we're kind of tentatively calling a public policy agenda for volunteerism. And if you're interested in that, I hope that you'll contact us and talk specifically about that. Okay. Now, this is the most important number we say in Sacramento, and we say this all the time in Sacramento, and that is nonprofits bring more than $40 billion every single year into California from out of state. And people in Sacramento, and actually people in general, tend to think that nonprofits use up money instead of realizing that what we do is we actually bring in money. So we bring in $40 billion a year from out of state. Now, how do we do that? Well, the first place we do it is we federal government. So we bring in federal dollars. That's number one. Secondly, we bring in money from out-of-state foundations, and you'll see that a little bit later, a little bit more. But foundations like the Gates Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Ford Foundation, Open Society, all of those are foundations that give in California. And thirdly, we have individual donors from all over the world who donate to California nonprofits. So you take a nonprofit like Sierra Club is very well known. They're headquartered in San Francisco. Oh, they moved to Oakland, sorry. But but people support the Sierra Club from all over the world. So all these things together mean that we actually bring in money, and to help people understand that. And this is also one of the ways in which nonprofits and business, which are often kind of on opposite sides of a given issue, this is one area where we can unite, because if together nonprofits and business can bring money into a community, everybody wins. It's more jobs, it's more services for employees, it's more nonprofit work. So that instead of thinking about being in opposition to business, think about how can we work with them to bring money into our community rather than redistribute within the community. All right, now one of these 6 things represents 37% of nonprofit revenue, okay, just one of these. And for this particular slide, we're eliminating hospitals or universities because, you know, hospitals and universities are kind of outliers. All right, so you only get to pick one of these, okay? Which of these gives more money to the nonprofit community than anybody else? How many people think foundations? How many people think government? How many people think fees for service? How many people think individuals? How many people think corporations? And how many people think squeeze from stones? Okay, I myself, my hands are tired this morning from squeezing stones all morning. The answer is fees for service. Okay, now I would say that in general, I can't see you guys, but most people vote for individual donations. It's really interesting. Now, in this particular graph, individual donations, foundations, and corporate grants are all lumped together because that's how they are on the 990. So it's kind of hard to pull those apart. But we know that corporate grants and foundation grants typically represent a little bit less than 5% of nonprofit revenue all the time. It's kind of interesting because of how much attention we pay to corporations and foundation grants. But nonetheless, the fact is that we are a sector that overall earns our money. But of course, nonprofit business models are very different from one subsector to the other. So in this particular case, the green section here is earned income program revenue. So you can see that hospitals are almost all program revenue, right? And then you can see at the bottom of that, international, only 8% of that international aid comes from earned revenue, and they have a much higher, so everyone is different. But what you can also see from looking at this is that every single subsector of our nonprofit community gets all kinds of income. We get donations, we get government money, we get revenue, we fees for service, we get other kinds of income. So another way of putting this is that all of us are hybrid organizations. Now, you've probably heard people say things like, oh, nonprofits rely on government. And it is true that about 30% of the nonprofit sector as a whole, its money comes from government. But what we don't say often enough, government relies on nonprofits. So for example, 32% of Medi-Cal services are delivered by nonprofits. So, you know, one of the things we've all been learning about lately is supply chains, right? Like the food supply chain has farmers, it has wholesalers, it has truckers, it has retailers. It has, you know, all those people I saw in the grocery store today with their phones, you know, picking up groceries in a rush because they're working for Instagram or DoorDash or somebody. So these are all parts of the food supply chain. And in fact, nonprofits are the core of government's services supply chain. And just like government has an important role to play in protecting and nurturing our food supply chain, it also has an important role to play in protecting and nurturing the services supply chain, of which nonprofits are really a central component. So this little picture is meant to show how governments and nonprofits depend on each other. It's not just a one-way street. Right. As many of you know who do have government contracts, you know that there are a lot of problems with them. 68% said that the payments don't cover the full cost of services. Now, I have to say, I was talking to a person who runs a Meals on Wheels just a few days ago, they get less than $5 per delivered meal. Okay, there's no way that that's enough. All right, that's actually $4.15 per delivered meal that they do. So that means that that's a perfect example of payments do not cover the full cost of their services. So they have to raise private money to be able to do the kinds of things, to be able to deliver meals the way that they do. I mean, it's just one small thing. They're not allowed to use government money to pay for dessert, which, you know, some of us feel like that's the only part of dinner worth eating. In any case, so the So what we do is we have to raise private money. And I think one of the things that's a little bit not immediately obvious is that also keeps us from scaling. Because let's just say that you have a $100,000 program and you're getting $70,000 of it from government, but it costs you that much to run it. Largely because of low overhead rates that they provide. And then the government says, we want to double this program. Well, you're thinking, but I can't double the amount of money that we raise to support this program. So people have to end up turning down opportunities to grow larger. So in any case, these are some of the other really significant aspects of contract problems that nonprofits have with government. And another way of describing this is our advocacy agenda, right, is to work on these kinds of issues. And a little bit later, we'll get to how these have been affected by the coronavirus. Right. Now, one thing that people hear say all the time is, I can't tell how to find a government grant. And that's absolutely right. Because, for example, you know, if you, let's say you're looking for mental health money from the state, well, you might think, well, I should go to the Department of Health and Human Services, and you would be right. But there's also mental health grants in corrections, in fish and wildlife, in education, right, in all kinds of different places. And so you would have to look through these very Byzantine websites to try to find that. So we sponsored up a piece of legislation in 2018 that passed, authored by Monique Limon from the Santa Barbara area. And what it is it mandates the creation of one website from the state that will make available all the grants that are available to nonprofits from every single department, and all of it clickable to the application. And this is mandated to start on July 1 of this year. And it could, of course, it could not come at a better time, because it's going to have to include all the coronavirus opportunities. And we've been talking with the people at the state government who are working on that. And of course, they're trying very hard because they have so many more things now that they need to kind of take into account here. But I just want to make sure that you pay attention to this and look in July for it. And it's called grants.ca.gov, which is, you know, a very catchy name that you can tell wasn't developed by a very expensive branding company. Okay. Just a few more things. So we actually are a sector of family farms. You know, less than 2% of all nonprofits in California have budgets of more than 10 million. So they eat up a lot of the contributions and revenue, but we really are family farms. In fact, 2/3 of California nonprofits are all volunteer organizations, right? So sometimes you hear people say these things like, you know, well, there's too many nonprofits. And the first thing you have to say, are you saying you think there are too many daffodil clubs? You know, what exactly are you talking about? Most of our 2/3 of our nonprofits are unstaffed. And actually, I think the best answer to that is to say there are actually not enough good nonprofits. Right. Oh, one more point I wanted to make about this. So, you know, agriculture knows that when it goes to the state capitol, they put family farms on the stand, right? But we know that farming in California is largely driven by large agricultural interests. And we nonprofits, somehow we do the different. We actually are a family for our farm industry, but we always talk about the big guys, the hospitals and the universities. And we need to embrace the fact that we have 2/3 of our nonprofits are all volunteer, embrace that and celebrate that, and make sure that people understand and value that about us, right? So this is, I can't actually see the headline. Oh, this is grant making. Okay, this is foundation grants. And so you can see that the bulk of foundation grants in California go to health and education, mostly higher education, universities and colleges. And you can see here that the kind of the golden hued is California-based foundations, and the oranger ones are foundations that are not based in California. So it's interesting to see not just where foundation money is going to, but also really a pretty significant amount comes from out-of-state foundations. And more of us should be looking at out-of-state foundations, I think, than it usually occurs to do that. And in this, the actual report, it has a bunch of stuff like the top 25 foundations that make grants from outside of California to California nonprofits and stuff like that. Okay. And, you know, anyway, all right, Disparities Matter, right? And this is probably the most important, in some ways, section of this whole report, Causes Count. So back to the quizzes. Okay, who has more money? How many people think Northern California nonprofits? How many people think Southern California? How many people think this is why we should be 6 states or at least 3? Usually everybody votes for the other side. Okay, in fact, Northern California is the answer. Now that line across the state, that's the traditional dividing line between Northern and Southern California, because it's the line at which about 50% of the population lives above and 50% below. And that's right at the top of Kern County near Bakersfield, if you kind of know where that is. But so you can see that Northern California nonprofits have about $3,200 per capita, whereas Southern California nonprofits just below that have $2,300 per capita. So that's a pretty significant difference just there, but let's look a little bit more closely. So which nonprofits have more money? Is it rural nonprofits or metropolitan ones? Is it poor ones or wealthier ones? Is it mostly people of color ones or mostly white ones? Okay, this one's so easy. You should be kicked out of class if you get it wrong. Okay, so the fact is that metropolitan, wealthier, and mostly white communities have significantly more money than the kinds of communities we see on the left-hand side. And this is, of course, a chart from the box, and you can see, just taking a look at the colors, the wealthier, the more money that nonprofits have per capita or per resident is probably a better way of saying it, the oranger it is. So you can see, you know, pretty quickly which are the areas that have more money. And then I just picked out a few that I think would be of special interest to this group. The highest one is San Francisco with an amazing $14,000 per resident. Okay, this is the nonprofit community as a whole. How much income a year does the whole community get to serve that community? And the lowest is Calusa with an amazing $97 per resident. Now you can see here San Bernardino and Riverside are also here. They're significantly lower than some of the other ones, but they're not at the absolute bottom. So I think, this should make your eyes open and say something like, these disparities are unbelievable and unforgivable. And it is, in fact, a call to action, particularly for county-based and local nonprofits to get together and to argue to the state government, as well as to their foundation community. Now, one of the things we have in the full report is we don't demonstrate that this is just true in whole. It's also true if you look at government funding is inequitably distributed. Foundation funding is inequitably distributed. So it's not just one or the other. And it's, again, this is an important call to action for all of us.
Jan, I have a question for you.
Yeah.
The question is California a net exporter of grant-making dollars or an importer? In other words, do our foundations grant out-of-state/country nonprofits more than their own nonprofits bring in?
What does everybody think? I don't hear anybody talking. Okay, so the answer is we are a net exporter. And actually, until 6 years ago, we were a net importer of foundation funds. And 6 years ago, we became a net exporter. And at the time, we were thinking, is that like a blip? But now it seems to be kind of, it's been every year since then. So it looks like it's a trend. And I think we don't exactly know why, but I think a lot of that, you know, is the growth of the new foundations based in California, particularly among technology companies that also, you know, have plants elsewhere and spend money outside of California. But we are significantly now an exporter. And I want to just say, you know, we don't necessarily think that there are other worthwhile causes outside of California, but so we don't necessarily want to say that that's wrong, but it's interesting.
Okay, thank you, Jan.
Yeah. Just a quicker look at nonprofits and communities of color, and to show here that the disparities are actually getting worse. So you can see this for some reason. Let me see if I can get it out. So, so since 2012, nonprofit revenue in communities of color has grown by 19%, but in predominantly white communities, it's grown by 30%. So I think, you know, despite, I think our nonprofit leaders talking so much about equity has certainly been important, but you can see that it's not playing out in terms of revenue dollars for our communities. I have a little bit of specific information about Riverside and San Bernardino counties. So this one here looks at total revenue to the nonprofit community. And so first of all, if you look on the left-hand side there, those little tiny towers there, so that's the number of nonprofits. All right, and then you can also remember that probably about 2/3 of those are all volunteer organizations. And then you can look at the employees, and it's really interesting to see here how San Bernardino does not have, has actually fewer nonprofits, but look at how many more employees that they have, 57,000 compared to 30. So that speaks to the very large organizations that are in San Bernardino. Then you can see volunteers, again, it's almost even the number of volunteers that we mobilize, and then the median revenue. And this is an important one because it tells you what the typical nonprofit look like. And you can see that actually these numbers are pretty small, right? The typical nonprofit in both counties has budgets of under 100,000. I'm not sure what lessons to draw from this, but I'm sure you all will have many more thoughts about that than I ever would. And then just looking at revenue per capita, now on the right-hand side, you can see that ranking, there are 58 counties in California, and Riverside is 50th in revenue per capita, and San Bernardino is 28th. So this is, again, these are both reasons for advocacy, both to state government and to the foundation community. Here's a little bit of look. Now, again, this one here, we're just looking at California-based foundations, right? Not out-of-state foundations for right now. And these are the 10 that make the most, that give out the most amount of money. And these are the 10 regions. I'm thinking of a different graph. Okay, and what's really interesting about this is how many of them are in the Bay Area, right? There's the Bay Area. Oh, I'm thinking of the wrong chart. I'm sorry. But you can see that the Bay Area and Los Angeles in this chart just swamp everybody else, right? That's where the money is. And we kind of knew that, right? But it is stark to see it. And I think it's another reason for us to, all of us, even if we are in the areas that have more access to foundation dollars, to be arguing with our foundation funders that, for example, if they give to an orchestra in Los Angeles, they should also be giving to an orchestra in Eureka, or giving to an orchestra in Riverside. Again, it's kind of a call to action. And this is the one I was talking about accidentally, the top 25 California foundations. And look at how many of them are in the Bay Area. Silicon Valley, Packard, Hewlett, San Francisco, Google, and James Irvine. 6 of these 10 are all in the Bay Area. So that says a lot about kind of why people in the Bay Area, for example, pay so much more attention to foundations than people in the Inland Empire do, given the fact that there just aren't as many foundations and there aren't as many foundation dollars. One of the things that kind of muddies the data a little bit is donor advised funds, sometimes called DAFs, DAFs. And just as one example, the Silicon Valley Community Foundation, in 2017, that they made $1 billion, $1.8 billion in grants. But 95% of that came from donor advised funds. So what that means is 95% of those grants were made by donors who hold funds at the Silicon Valley Community Foundation. So in a certain way, it's great to hear that they gave out $1.8 billion. And on the other hand, we realized that the Community Foundation itself did not have as much money to give out in terms of money over which they have the decision-making power. So we also took a quick look at staff. So compared to the for-profit sector, nonprofits in California have higher percentages of women and people of color. So you can see in California employees, the nonprofit workforce is 63%, whereas in the overall workforce, women are 45%. People of color, it's closer, 31 and 20. It really shows up in leadership. So in boards of directors, women in nonprofit boards are 56%, and in Fortune 500 boards, only 23%. People of color, 27% on nonprofit boards and 16% in public companies. And then in staff leadership, women are 73% of the nonprofit leadership staff, which is meant to be a member of the management team here. And across all industries, it's 29%. And then in people of color on management teams, 29% compared to 12%. So a lot of people make guesses about these kinds of numbers, and it's good to have some data that actually, that we can actually rely on. Now, a lot of times we nonprofits say things like, nobody understands nonprofits. And if they just understood us, they would give us more money. And I want to say something, this is so important. The public already loves us. Okay, we need to stop acting as if they don't like us. They may not understand us, but you know what? Nobody understands anything anymore. Like, I have relatives that are farmers. Nobody understands farming. And sometimes they say things like, if only people understood farming, they would be willing to pay higher prices. And that just isn't true. And so I think that the important part here is that the public really likes us. And you can see here, the gold color is nonprofits, the green is for-profits, and the gray is government. So you can see that this is the most amazing one. This was, by the way, this was a random study of 2,000 California residents, although it was conducted only in English. All right, so it's a random sample of 2,000 English-speaking California residents. But 68% of those people said that we create jobs for people in our communities, and 67% fewer saw for-profits as job creators. Work efficiently, we came out better on that. We knew we were going to come out better on acting ethically and positive social change, but this is a very important message that Californians really see us as job creators and as efficient, smart, careful users of money. Of course, because CalNonprofits is a policy organization, we also wanted to hear more about policy advocacy. And this is very interesting. Within the last 12 months, 76% of nonprofits said that they had met with public officials or their staff. And 53% belong to a coalition that lobbies, like the California Association of Nonprofits, or like the California Association of Food Banks, for example, or of symphony orchestras. Sometimes you'll hear these statistics like only 4% of nonprofits lobby, and that's because only 4% fill out the special government form that gives you a little bit more leeway on lobbying. But nonetheless, 76, and nobody, like when I ask people, do you lobby? They say like, no. Oh, I did talk to the mayor last week. I saw him at the grocery store, and I told him we really need to get the zoning in front of our health clinic changed. Well, that's meeting with government public officials or their staff, and it's lobbying, but we don't count it that way, right? So it's better. This is a better question. To have you met with public officials or their staff? Now, what we really wish that encouraged constituents to vote was like 100%. I think one of the things that the coronavirus has really shown us is how nonprofits are first responders. We're on the front lines. We are so crucial and so important. And it's also shown us that it matters who's in office. And so we have this campaign we're going to be rolling out again. I work for a nonprofit and I vote. So the idea being, of course, if everybody who worked or volunteered in childcare voted, we'd have better childcare policies, right? If everybody who worked or volunteered in the environment voted, we'd have better environmental policies. So that's going to be an important part of our campaign that you'll see later this year. I'm just going to point out a couple of changes since the last report we did. And this first one is the main one I wanted to talk about, which is that this is rural versus metro. And this is in 2012, for every dollar that metropolitan nonprofits had, rural nonprofits had 61 cents. Now they have 59 cents, right? So things are getting worse, not better. Nonprofit wages went up 23%, statewide 25%. So this reflects what we already know from historical data, which is that in times of economic downturns, nonprofit jobs and wage levels are more stable. But in times of economic upturn, the for-profit sector raises wages and increases the number of jobs much faster. So since we, all things tell us that we're looking at kind of a many years look at recession or depression, rejoice to thinking you're probably actually better off with your nonprofit job than you are, say, with my daughter who used to work at a technology company and now she's been laid off. Right. It's also just interesting to note that foundation assets have grown 34%, and that donor advised funds now represent more than 10% of charitable giving. And then, we've all heard the idea of the shrinking of the middle class in America, that, we used to have kind of like the idea was not very many poor people, a lot of middle class people. not very many rich people. And now we're kind of in what's sometimes called the barbell economy, where we have lots of rich people, really a lot of poor people, and kind of a relatively small middle class. And this is happening in the nonprofit ecosystem as well. Our largest nonprofits are getting bigger. We continue to always have the same, changing of small nonprofits, but our middle class nonprofits are becoming smaller and smaller. And I think this has very serious implications for our nonprofit ecosystem. And I think particularly, I think some of our foundation leaders, I would ask them to be thinking more about looking at nonprofit ecosystems and delivery systems and not just kind of at individual organizations. Right. So this is kind of our call to action. And it's simply that, whenever you're in a room where somebody says, what does business think? Or what does the chamber think? So whoever you are, always say, you know what, that's a good question. And here's another good question. What do nonprofits think? Because when we get nonprofits to the table, we always say all the right things, but we need to get to the table. All right, so now I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and Karthik is going to share his screen and have a chance to see some much more in-depth data about the Inland Empire in particular. So take it away, Karthik.
Thank you, Jan.
Mm-hmm.
Let me, I'm going to introduce Karthik while he's doing that. Can you hear me? Okay. Hi, Karthik. Okay. Thank you, Jan. That was wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. At this time, our next presenter is Karthick Ramakrishnan. He's a director of the Center of Social Innovation at UCR. He's a professor of political science and associate dean of UC's Riverside School of Public Policy. His research focuses on civic participation, public opinion, and immigration policy in the United States. Welcome, Karthik, and we're really excited you could join us for this conversation today.
Thank you, Debbie, and Jan, great to see you. And thank you for not only presenting all that information, but providing a compelling narrative and call to action. And your humor is, I love your brand of humor. It's going to be hard to follow what you did, but I'll try. This is very timely because we just recently released a report last month on the state of nonprofits in the Inland Empire. And I think some of what we find, Jan, will actually connect up with some of the questions you had in terms of what some of these patterns might mean in the Inland Empire. Some of the numbers will be a little bit different because I should note that the Causes Counts report focuses on nonprofits that have had their most recent tax filings, and I believe revenues greater than $50,000, whereas we look at the entire universe, I think including religious organizations and others, just to get a sense of that larger landscape. But we also have information about some of those larger nonprofits. In terms of key findings in the limited time we have, I'll just note a few. One, most people, I've been in the Inland Empire since 2005, and for the better part of a decade, I've been hearing from people about the Irvine Report. So if anyone tells you about the Irvine Report in the nonprofit sector, it was a report that was commissioned by the James Irvine Foundation, published in 2009, and in many ways still, I think, looms large in people's minds about the nonprofit sector. So this report is the first in more than a decade to update those numbers and also pay attention to certain things that report did not pay attention to. So one, the nonprofit sector has grown tremendously in the last decade, both in terms of numbers as well as nonprofits with relatively large budgets. Nonprofits have also benefited from more philanthropy in the region, and we have some data here. You can find all of these infographics as well as the full report at socialinnovation.ucr.edu. Another major finding, very much in line with the statewide numbers that Jan had, is that nonprofit jobs are good jobs. This is particularly important in a region like ours, where nonprofits don't have a great reputation, and it's not based on the data or evidence. And I can't tell you the number of times, even in the last 2 or 3 weeks, in which I've had to convince people that yes, nonprofit jobs are good jobs, especially compared to other private sector jobs in our region. This is not true in the Bay Area, for example, in terms of pay, but it's absolutely true in the Inland Empire. Nonprofits are also working more in coalition and collaboration with each other. One of the major findings in the 2009 report was that most of the nonprofits had very limited capacity. Well, what we've seen in the last decade is that many of these small to medium-sized nonprofits have started to build coalitions with each other. We're also seeing this in the capacity building space. So the Inland Empire Capacity Builders Network is an example of that. You're seeing it in the philanthropic space with the Funders Alliance also coming together, coordinating, and that is really helpful, right? So there's two ways that you can go up to scale. One is to scale up an individual nonprofit, and we are seeing examples of that, but we're also seeing a lot of examples of coalition building and coordination. Census has been probably the most dramatic example of that. So we've had close to $7 million in investments in both public and private dollars coming in here. And most of those dollars have gone to the nonprofit sector as opposed to the government sector, because we saw the counties doing a fair amount of re-granting work to the nonprofits. Unfortunately, that's been an exception rather than the rule. So in our region, we need to have more government support of nonprofits. We also saw a lot of fundraising equity in terms of how the state dollars came down. That's important. Finally, nonprofit leaders have an increasing focus on systems change as well as social enterprise, but COVID-19 has revealed some limitations. Few data points that I'll go through very quickly. There's a lot of talk about nonprofits. In fact, a lot of talk about startups. Startups have a certain kind, they capture the imagination in a certain way in California. They connote innovation. And a lot of people, when they think about startups, they think about the Bay Area. Well, if you think about nonprofit startups, the highest share of nonprofit startups that have been created since 2010 have been in the Inland Empire, right? So this is looking within each region. What that means is that there's a particular kind of support that they need in order not just to survive, but then ultimately to thrive and grow. You look at wages, this shows you that the Inland Empire, jobs in the Inland Empire in the nonprofit sector pay higher than the overall private sector. This is data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and this has been true for several years. So when many people talk about good jobs, they have to be thinking about the nonprofit sector as providing those jobs. Now, it is true that the majority of nonprofit jobs in the Inland Empire are concentrated in the health sector, but even if you look within the health sector as well as other sectors, we find that nonprofit jobs within each sector pay more than for-profit jobs. Someone in the chat had asked whether foundation giving has been increasing in the region. It has. It's been increasing more in Riverside County than in San Bernardino County, and that's something important to pay attention to, is this gap between the two counties. In terms of incoming foundation dollars per capita, so there's different, this comes from data from the Foundation Center. We look at overall giving coming from outside of the region and also giving within the region, and we find problems in both. So even though you're seeing that increase in giving, our region still lags behind the rest of California, including the Central Valley, in terms of incoming dollars. It's also true when it comes to giving within the region, which we don't have time to go into, but the Inland Empire not only has fewer large foundations than even the Central Valley, either on an absolute basis or per capita basis, but even giving in terms of internal philanthropy is lower here, and that's going to be an important area for outreach and education. We also conducted a survey in addition to analysis of IRS records and Foundation Center records. And a couple of things I want to flag here. This was done before COVID. We have had COVID-19 response surveys afterwards where the revenue picture has only gotten more important, but increasing and diversifying revenues were top priorities. But then look at the next two, right? Getting recognized by news media and government has also been important. A lot of nonprofits do good, important work, but they're finding it a struggle to get their narrative out and also to get government to recognize and value what they do. And I'll say that this has been very painfully apparent during the COVID-19 response in terms of many government officials not even thinking about the nonprofit sector as an important part of the economy. Our research, similar to what CalNonprofits finds, is that they're a big chunk of the GDP. Nonprofits are 10% of the GDP in San Bernardino County, 5% of the GDP in Riverside County, and they deserve the kind of respect that other economic actors have. Finally, to just wrap up, and happy to talk about more later, you can also check out our report on our website. We have a few set of recommendations, and I'll say a lot of this is based on interviews that we did that you'll find in the report, our survey. I'm on the board of the California Endowment, so some of it is based on that experience, as well as just living and working in the region with community partners for the better part of a decade. One is to focus on scaling up in addition to starting up organizations. So we need a lot of capacity building support for that. Two, build on the foundations of Census 2020. In many ways, I think of that as a very bright moment for the nonprofit sector, working hand in hand with government, building a really solid foundation for collaboration across the diversity of our region. Three, build for digital work as well as co-located work. Right now, it's very difficult to think as locations mattering, but we do have examples of nonprofits that have co-located in either in the same building or near each other, and they derive strength from that, and that can build even stronger coalitions. Invest in narrative change as well as government relations. So as nonprofits grow, they should think about hiring an external affairs person who can do government relations and media outreach. Invest in youth leadership, women, and people of color. People of color are 69% of our region, but the diversity of our nonprofit boards and leadership don't reflect that. We have to invest in the future in our youth, in women, and people of color. Six, leverage our industry and grassroots connections. Arts nonprofits are under-resourced here compared to their share of the nonprofit landscape. Well, arts and entertainment is an important part of industry in Southern California when we think about Hollywood and other aspects of the entertainment industry. So here is a really huge opportunity for nonprofits in our region to connect with industry partners as well as grassroots partners in LA, and to think of us as part of that Southern California whole. And then finally, we have to engage and cultivate regional philanthropy. A couple of recommendations for government. One is for government to build on the Census 2020 foundations, rather than just say, well, you know, it's been great and see you again in 9 years. We really think that instead of folding up the tent, we have to maintain those tables because they are truly inclusive tables. Government should also recognize and promote nonprofits, including anytime they talk about small businesses, they have to think about nonprofits as part of that universe. And then finally, for philanthropy, fair amount of philanthropy invests in outside consultants coming in and temporarily helping people out. We have a lot of research and other technical assistance, capacity building capacity in our region. Philanthropy has to invest in local talent if we are going to build this up in a way that can be self-sufficient and self-sustaining. And then finally, there's a lot of talk about regional equity when it comes to dollars. We have to recognize that racial equity also means regional equity. We are a majority Latino region. We are a 2/3 people of color region. When we think about capital in the coast, especially in Orange County and LA County, if they care about racial equity, they have to care about the Inland Empire. I'll leave it at that, and thank you for your time.
Karthick, I have one question for you before you go. It says, does your data regarding nonprofits are good jobs include municipalities, schools, and water districts, which I've seen pay astonishingly well?
So this data comes from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in which they compare nonprofit jobs to all private sector jobs. We know from other data sets that government jobs in the Inland Empire do tend to pay well. By the way, these jobs also tend to have benefits. But you know, the key is if you look at the reason why nonprofits jobs pay so much better than private sector jobs, part of it is that the sectoral mix. And part of that is because when you look at jobs in logistics and retail, they do not tend to pay well, they do not have benefits. And yet we have this rhetoric as if the only jobs that matter are jobs in logistics and retail. And people really need to reframe the kind of values we want to hold up as a region, and to see nonprofits as providing, nonprofits are in the private sector, right? A lot of people think nonprofits, oh, well, they're kind of like government. It's like, no, they're actually private sector jobs. And they have a different kind of mission and orientation and tax structure that enables them to pay their employees better and to give them benefits.
Okay, great. Thank you. And we have more questions that we'll have after Jan's presentation. We'll open it up for some Q&A. So at this time, we're going to return back to Jan for a policy update on COVID-19, a few highlights of what's happened and what's needed now.
Well, first of all, thanks, Karthik. You know, I read over the slides a couple of days ago, but you added so much to them, and I just felt like underlining a lot of points or trying to make them in bold. And I think just two really struck out for me. One is, you know, the importance of investing locally and growing a nonprofit infrastructure in the Inland Empire, and you know, can't do that by parachuting people in all the time. And the second thing, this point, racial equity is regional equity. I think, you know, this is also such an important point for the COVID-19 crisis. So anyway, if we'd had highlighters, I would have been highlighting those things. So this was not meant to be a session on policy, but of course, policy is on everybody's mind. So we do want to just spend a couple of things about it. So this is just a very quick look, and I'm not going to go over this, but we found that the independent sector's resource guide is actually the one that seems to be kept more up to date than a lot of the other national ones in terms of what the federal benefits are. And I think all of you know that the Paycheck Protection Program is the one that has been giving forgivable loans to nonprofits that have fewer than 500 employees. One of the things that national nonprofit leadership are focusing on is more money to the Paycheck Protection Program, also extending the 500 employees to more, but just for nonprofits. For example, to cover the people who are in affordable housing, healthcare, are particular two areas where it's very common to be over 500, but still really have so many of the characteristics of a small business and a community-based nonprofit. And then also looking at adding some other kinds of nonprofits, in particular C6s, associations, and C4. So we'll have to kind of see about that. But so rather than go over these, I'm going to encourage you to go to the independent sector's website to look at these in more depth. And then I do want to say a little bit more about California benefits. And I think that in general, I think we've seen that very strong leadership, not just from the governor, but also from the leaders in both the Assembly and the State Senate. So for example, the $600 a week additional in unemployment, but it does not affect your state unemployment tax rate. Self-insured organizations that belong to a trust such as U.S. Trust, for example, they're generally getting only 50% reimbursement for payments. And this is something that we're watching and talking to a lot of people about. So you can just see some of these other things. And reporting, the parallel deadline for the 990 has been delayed now. And so the California state has also said that they are delaying the 199 and other forms that have kind of marched in line with the 990. And there are now some small loan guarantees for small business, but the application process still is very unclear, so we don't really know about that. Volunteer Match is, most of you know Volunteer Match. It's a volunteer matching website, and it's on the left-hand side, and they have now a special COVID-19 section, and I would encourage you to go there, because if you register your volunteer opportunities there, they don't just show up on Volunteer Match, but Volunteer Match powers, for example, Google employee volunteerism site and a number of other corporations, and very soon it's going to also power the site on Cal Volunteers for people that are volunteering through that particular, who are seeking a volunteer area. And I also think I just want to encourage all of us nonprofit folks to think about volunteering. They have a lot of really interesting virtual volunteering opportunities as well. So something I've been thinking about volunteering is transcribing historical documents, right? Like, so they show you pictures of, you know, old documents and typing them out. That sounds like something would be within my skill level and something I could probably be interested in doing. And then this last one on the right-hand side, you know, the governor has issued an executive order that frees counties so that they can impose limitations on commercial evictions. So you know that federally, there's been a moratorium on, or statewide, I should say, there's a moratorium on residential evictions, but there hasn't been something on commercial evictions. And But now many counties are moving to institute a moratorium on commercial evictions, which of course, since nonprofits are commercial property renters and commercial property owners, that's something that's important to us. I want to talk about the particular policy agenda that we at CalNonprofits are working on. So you can see this the first graph up there. This is the survey that we did with 650 or so respondents within just 5 days. A shocking 86% said that their contracts with government, they are not getting flexibility on deliverables, and that's hurting their ability to serve. And so what I'm talking about here are things like, you might have a health clinic, for example, and they have a contract to do a certain number of TB tests. Well, not as many people are coming in for TB tests, and instead they're turning their whole attention to COVID-19 testing, but their government contracts are not flexible. They can't easily move that money from one type of test to another one. Or senior centers, for example, they have government contract with the counties typically to provide senior meals. People no longer can come to their sites in church basements and places like that. So they're delivering meals, but they're not able to do the same amount as they were before. So what we're really seeing is we really need flexibility in government contracts right now, particularly for organizations in essential services. And the other one that's so important, just to summarize, the other one that's really important is we need to be treated equally with for-profits when it comes to things like, for example, because we're such important employers, any benefits to employers need to be benefits for nonprofit employers as well. Because we do rent so much commercial space, any benefits to commercial tenants need to also benefit nonprofit as well as small business tenants. So we have more than 1,100 nonprofits have signed on to a letter supporting these issues, as well as 30 members of the California legislature. And so you can see kind of part of that letter in the lower right-hand corner. And this is one of the most important things that we're doing. And we're seeing a lot of counties, like maybe you'll see the health department in one county being flexible, but maybe the education department, the health and human services in the same county not being as flexible. Many nonprofits operate in more than one county, so they're having different standards. So what we really need is a statewide standard that gives counties the flexibility to help nonprofits be able to continue to be doing the work that they need to be doing. I talked to one guy who's the CFO of a nonprofit health clinic. So the costs of masks for their clinic have gone up from $40,000 a month to $100,000 a month. That's per month, and that's masks only, all right? Now they have a few vacant positions in their organization. They want to take the money from the vacant positions and use that money to be buying masks. But right now their government contracts are so inflexible they can't do that. So they're doing it anyway, but they're at high risk of never getting those funds reimbursed because they have not been able to get the flexibility that we nonprofits really need so badly. The other important point I want to make, the statement by the governor's office this morning shows a $54 billion deficit in the projected budget for next year. So I would say, like, more normally, the first thing that we hear is that there's like a $10 billion deficit, right? A $54 billion deficit means that every government department is going to be cut seriously. So something that we all need to be thinking about is, for our own organization, is what is that going to mean for our organizations and for the people that we work with? What is it going to mean for them? It's going to mean, for families that have children with disabilities, that's going to mean fewer services for them. It's going to mean less money for public schools. And so this is something I think, a phrase I like a lot is this one, which is that one law is worth 100 grant proposals. And I think it's never been clear the importance of advocacy, that only government can bring in the kinds of money and the kinds of policies that are going to meet the really enormous needs of our communities. And when government matters, advocacy matters. So I'm hoping that people will, again, join the Inland Empire Community Collaborative, join the association in your field, like the Association of Animal Welfare Organizations or wildlife organizations, or any one of the many coalitions, because that's how you'll find out the really specifics. But I also hope that you'll join all the coalitions that are focusing on supporting the nonprofit community as a whole during what looks like it's going to be a very difficult 5 to 10 years coming up.
Great, thank you, Jan. I just have one closing question for either Karthick or Jan or both of how can elected officials best support nonprofits?
Jan, I'll let you go first and I can.
Oh, you're cheating. Well, it depends on which elected official. You know, if Trump were willing to listen to us, I would write out a memo this afternoon. I think that right now we are holding a series of 15 town halls with members of the California Assembly and Senate. So look, we're only sending the notices about those to people who are in those districts. So be on the lookout for one notice, because we think nonprofits need to be able to speak directly with legislators. But I would say that what we need right now is we need legislators to pay attention to supporting the nonprofits that they can see are working in their communities. So nonprofits are in the front lines everywhere. And we seem to be at the back of the line when it comes in Sacramento, when it comes to the supports that we need. And when you look at the economic power that we have, I mean, somebody asked me a couple of days ago, something like, you know, what can nonprofits do to be helping the economy? And I'm like, we are the economy. Nobody says, you know, what can small business be doing? They get the idea. We need to be helping small business. And so I think helping legislators understand that, so as they look at the upcoming budget, but also as they look at these very simple fixes like the ones I mentioned don't cost a single cent more. And many counties have, not many, a few counties have already implemented those flexible changes. That's what we really need. And I would also say that we, you know, that I think we need public officials to also make public calls for supports to the disadvantaged regions in our community. I don't think it's enough to just say give to a COVID fund, because if you give to a COVID fund in Beverly Hills, it's going to give it out in Beverly Hills. Now, I'm not trying to be anti-Beverly Hills, but I do think that, you know, we should be saying, you know, that inequity is so much more revealed in this crisis. We cannot allow what we're doing about the crisis to amplify and increase inequity. So people who live in Beverly Hills, to pick on Beverly Hills, all right, they need to be giving to poor areas. And that's also true in San Francisco and other areas. And we need to call on philanthropists, and we need to call on government, and we need to call on foundations to see this as an opportunity for addressing disparities, not just reflecting them.
The only thing I'll say, whatever Jan said, I think probably applies 10-fold or 100-fold in our region. It's kind of like that Rodney Dangerfield, we don't get any respect. You know, it's just, it's so evident here, and especially, you know, with COVID-19 response, you would think people would recognize, right, in terms of social services, right. Nonprofit, I think there's a recognition that nonprofits are important, but they're kind of relegated to this status. There's all sorts of analysis you can do, right, in terms of feminism and all of this, in terms of the devaluing of work. I would say immediate things that people can do is make sure that nonprofit voices are being heard when it comes to COVID recovery and economic recovery and response. It is really shameful in my mind in terms of how sidelined nonprofits have been in both counties so far. And nonprofits can expend up to 20% of their resources to advocate. So we should not, and in most cases, I haven't looked at the budgets in the Inland Empire, but generally speaking, most nonprofits don't even go anywhere close to that line in terms of being able to advocate. We have had capacity building and training opportunities, like Alliance for Justice shows you what you can do to make sure you don't step over that line. It's time for nonprofits to speak up. It's time for nonprofits to mobilize and to really engage our communities, right? It's not just the leaders talking. When Jan talks about encouraging people to vote, encouraging people to make their voices heard, if we don't speak up, others will speak up for us. And it's really important for nonprofits to step up. That's
excellent. Well, thank you. What an amazing day. we've had. And thank you both, Karthick and Jan, for taking the time out to give us all the information. And what I want to say also at this time is on behalf of the Inland Empire Capacity Building Network, thank you for helping us pull this all together and bring all these questions home. And we could not have done this, I say, when this originally came up, we could not have done this without CalNonprofits and the Capacity Building Network. But we also definitely could not have done it without Karina Paredes Arzola, who's been monitoring all day, and Christine Metropolis. They've just put many hours and effort and time into not only helping me learn Zoom and all the technology, but just their patience and experience. So we really appreciate you and thank you. And if Karina, you could advance our next slide, I'm going to answer someone's question here. All right. Someone asked, how can you get involved with CalNonprofits and the advocacy work going and be part of the conversation? And here is it. We encourage everyone. Remember, there's, if I remember correctly, over 10,000 organizations now supported. So more. You can join calnonprofits.org. They have, as you see on this slide, tremendous benefits for doing that. And so that's the way to get involved. And as Karina said earlier, we will be sending out the recording and the slides and getting that all back to you. We're sorry we couldn't answer all the questions today, but we thank you for being here and have a great day. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks for having us, Debbie, and the Inland Empire Capacity Building Network.
Yes,
Thank you, guys.
we're happy. Okay, thank you very much.
Bye.